This episode was suggested by a listener, Lydia P., on Twitter. If you'd like to make a suggestion, you can do so on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. As it's October and Halloween is just around the corner, I wanted to do some extra creepy episodes. This week, our topic involves objects that have been made out of human skin. It can be quite descriptive, so if that's something you'd rather not hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Most of us in the creepy community have heard of objects being made out of human skin. The first thing that comes to mind for most people is Ed Gein, the American murderer and corpse thief who made furniture and clothing from human skin, the man who inspired Buffalo Bill from the film Silence of the Lambs. However, Ed Gein was not the first person to do this, though it can be said he was actually one of the least skilled at it. In the 1800s and 1900s and before, some truly interesting and well-made items were created from human skin in many parts of the world. The reason why these things were made are varied, but none of the people making them were considered criminals or even particularly disturbed. In fact, a few of the objects were made from the skin of criminals by the people who brought them to justice. I want to share some of these objects with you, as well as rumors of objects made from human skin, and then talk about why they were made and why we are so disturbed by them today. The binding of books in human skin, or anthropodermic bibliopagy, is one of the most common uses of human skin, even though it's actually very rare. Most of the books bound in this way were bound in the 19th century. One of the most famous of these is called The Highwayman, Narrative of the Life of James Allen, alias George Walton, from 1837. It was written by James Allen himself, and on his deathbed he asked that the book be bound in his own skin, and then given to a man whom Allen had previously tried to rob and had fought back against him bravely. That's pretty metal in my opinion. Another famous book that has been found with this unusual binding is Hans Holbein's Dance of Death, a book full of grim woodcut images of people being led away by death. The original book dates from between 1523 and 1525, but there are 3 copies with a 19th century binding in human skin, 2 of which are now housed at Brown University in Rhode Island. Brown University also has a copy of Andreas Vesalius' 7-volume anatomy textbook, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, which is bound in human skin. It seems fitting, if not a little gruesome, that an anatomy text was bound in the largest organ in the human body. There's also a copy of Edgar Allan Poe's 1892 story, The Golden Bug, or L'Escarabée d'Or, as it is in French, that is bound in human skin. This book has a wonderfully macabre illustration on its spine of a skull with a gold bug descending from its eye socket. It was sold to a private collector in 2016 for around $1,000 US. These books were all analyzed by a group called the Anthropodermic Book Project. This group of chemists, librarians, and anthropologists have come together to track down, catalog, and most importantly test these books to see if they are indeed bound in leather made from human skin. Their goal is to create a catalog of these books and learn the reason for their unusual bindings. As DNA in the skin is too degraded by the tanning process to test, the Anthropodermic Book Project uses a method called peptide mass fingerprinting, or PMF, to test the leather covers. PMF can identify mammalian sources of collagen-based materials such as leather and parchment with 99% certainty to determine what animal the material came from. This process only needs a tiny amount of the leather, so the leather covers of the books are not destroyed by the process. They also use a method called follicle pattern recognition, which examines the hair follicle pattern on the leather. Human hair grows from special pores called follicles, and these follicles can be found all over the human body. Their shape and size varies depending on the type of hair they produce, such as the hair on the head versus the hair on the arms. The follicles in human skin are in a different pattern than most other animals. This method can be subjective, however, thanks to normal human variation, and depends largely on what process was used to tan the skin, as some methods can stretch the skin and distort the natural follicle pattern. Therefore, PMF is mainly used. So far, of the 49 books the Anthropodermic Book Project have identified, 32 have been tested or are in the process of being tested, and 18 have been found to actually be bound in human skin. Those that I've told you about are included in those 18 books. If you'd like to know more, the Anthropodermic Book Project have a very informative website you can visit at anthropodermicbooks.org. There were rumors of an entire tannery dedicated to producing only leather from human skin in the late 1700s and early 1800s in France. During the French Revolution, in which the monarchy was overthrown and then France was taken over by Napoleon, it is said that so many people were killed at the guillotine that the revolutionaries had culottes, or trousers or panties, made out of the skin of the dead nobles. Books and other objects, too, were said to come out of this tannery. The tannery was supposedly located at Château de Meudon, outside Paris. This castle overlooks the City of Lights and was acquired by King Louis XIV in 1695. He had it lavishly decorated, but used it as a hunting lodge instead of a home, and therefore it was often left vacant. His grandson, King Louis XVI, didn't use it at all, and it fell into disrepair during his reign. During the French Revolution, many royal properties were stripped of their valuables and finery, which reduced Château de Meudon to a husk of a large mansion. It was in this ruin that the tannery is rumored to have been set up. However, most scholars dismiss this rumor as revolutionary propaganda. The mansion is too far away from any sources of water which are needed in the tanning process, and it's also quite far out of town to be practical to transport nearly 3,000 nobles who were killed at the guillotine. Despite these complications, the rumor still pops up whenever a French book bound in human skin is identified. Images about the next item I want to tell you about have been circulating on the internet recently, which has earned them the nickname Necro Pants. The Museum of Icelandic Sorcery and Witchcraft, which is run by Siggi Atlason, has a display about an unusual piece of Icelandic spellwork called Nabrok. According to several Icelandic folktales that originate in the 1600s, this pair of trousers made from the complete skin of a man's lower half could make a person rich. The creation of the trousers and how they work is described by the museum's display. To make Nabrokarstafur, one must get permission from a living man to take his skin after death. Once the man is dead and buried, he must be dug up, and the skin from his entire lower half, feet and genitals included, must be removed all in one piece. As a person steps into them, they will stick to them like a second skin. Then, a coin must be stolen from a poor widow and placed in the scrotum along with a magic symbol or stave written on a piece of paper. The coin will continuously draw other coins into the scrotum, providing an unending source of money, as long as the original coin is not removed. Someone must always be wearing the trousers to keep the magic going. The magic symbol for the spell and how to do it can be found in several 17th century Icelandic grimoires or books of magic. Its true origin is hard to ascertain, as it could originate in the medieval era or from far earlier Germanic beliefs. Museum curator Siggy Atlason admits that it is very unlikely that anyone actually ever made Nabrok. The Nabrok on display at the museum was made by a renowned Icelandic stage designer, Arni Pál Johannsson. This piece of art has gained so much attention online that Stephen Fry mentioned the Nabrok on his BBC quiz show QI. After the show aired, the Museum of Icelandic Sorcery and Witchcraft saw a huge increase in visitors and is now rated as one of the top 10 best museums in Iceland. Let me know if you've ever visited this museum. It sounds like an amazing place. I have several more items to tell you about, but first, a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Our other sponsor is ThinkGeek, the premier retailer for the global geek community. Express your love of all that is geeky and nerdy with clever t-shirts and other unique apparel, home and office decor, electronics, collectibles, and more. ThinkGeek has great gifts whether you're into science or science fiction, and many of the items on their website you won't find anywhere else. Just follow our link, bit.ly/morbidgeek, to search their massive collection. That's bit.ly/morbidgeek to get your geek on. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? There are several tiers of patronage, the lowest being $1 an episode. With that dollar, you become eligible for several rewards, such as access to our patron-only feed and being entered in a monthly raffle. When you become a patron, it helps us keep this show going. If more people become patrons, we may even be able to eliminate the need for sponsors. That means no break in the middle of the show. If you'd like to become a patron, go to bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron, and you'll be directed to our Patreon page, where you can choose your rewards. You'll have our eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. During the rise of the study of anatomy, the professors and doctors were moving up in the social order. Many doctors used their newly gained respect and financial boons to have things made from materials that only they had access to. One of these materials was the skin of the corpses they worked with. And as public executions were one of the only legal ways to obtain a human corpse for dissection, these objects were made from the skin of hardened criminals. One of the most famous and very public cases in which this occurred was that of William Burke and William Hare. We discussed this case briefly during our corpse theft episode with Dr. Jenna Dittmar. Stealing corpses from burial grounds and selling them to anatomists was quite profitable during the rise of anatomy in the early 1800s. William Burke and William Hare wanted in on these profits, but didn't want to raid cemeteries. Instead, they murdered people and sold their fresh corpses to anatomists. In 1828, they killed 16 people in Edinburgh and sold them to Dr. Robert Knox for dissection before they were caught. Hare was offered immunity to give evidence against Burke, and then Burke confessed. William Burke was then hanged on January 28, 1829, in front of a crowd of around 25,000 people. His corpse was then dissected publicly by Professor Monroe of the University of Edinburgh. During that dissection, Dr. Monroe used Burke's blood to write a note, which said, "This is written in the blood of William Burke, who was hanged at Edinburgh." The blood was taken from his head. A death mask, or plaster cast of Burke's face after death, was made before his face was dissected. After the dissection, Burke's skin was sent to a tannery and made into a pocketbook. Judging by the wear at the corners of this pocketbook, it's likely it was used by someone for quite a while. Burke's skeleton was also defleshed completely and displayed in Surgeons Hall Museum at the university. You can still see all three of these items on display at the Surgeons Hall Museum. Several items were made from the skin of one Antoine LeBlanc, a murderer from the 1830s in New Jersey, in the United States. In 1833, he was working for room and board for Samuel Sayer and his family of Morristown, New Jersey. After 2 weeks of living in their basement and not being paid in cash, this privileged son of a well-to-do European family had had enough. LeBlanc faked some sort of distress with the family horses, lured Samuel into the barn, and killed him with a shovel to the face. He then used the same tactic on Mrs. Sayer. He covered up the 2 bodies with manure and then moved into the house. There he killed their servant Phoebe with a club as she slept. He then ransacked the house for any valuables and fled. Unbeknownst to LeBlanc, the sack he packed the loot in had a hole in it. He left a trail of Sayer's belongings, which were easy for Sheriff George Ludlow to follow. LeBlanc's trial began on August 13, 1833, at Morris County Courthouse. It only took the jury 20 minutes to find him guilty. His sentence was similar to that of William Burke. He was to be hung by the neck until dead, and his body was to be dissected. On September 6th, LeBlanc was hanged in front of a crowd of around 10,000 people. His body was then removed to Dr. Canfield's office. Dr. Canfield and Dr. Joseph Henry made a death mask of LeBlanc. They then proceeded to do several experiments. The idea that the body is controlled by electrical impulses sent by the brain was a new concept at the time, and these 2 doctors wanted to test the theory. They hooked the corpse up to a battery and shocked it. They were disappointed when the corpse didn't do much more than twitch. The next thing they did was flay the skin from the body and send it off to a tannery, where it was made into several keepsakes, such as wallets, purses, lampshades, and book jackets. Small strips were also tanned and then signed by Sheriff Ludlow to prove they came from LeBlanc. This piece of gruesome history faded as time moved on. It was thought to be an urban legend until 1995, when the estate of Carl Scherzer was being liquidated by Dawson's auctioneers and appraisers of Morris Plains, New Jersey. Scherzer had been an unofficial historian and collected many items of historical significance. Among his things, they found the death mask of LeBlanc, as well as a wallet made from his skin. The wallet is about 4.5 inches long and is a sickly green color. The leather is thin and frail and has lots of cracking and weathering. These 2 items now belong to Scherzer's son Douglas, who is the chief of police in Morris Plains. The question that still remains is, where are the rest of the items made from LeBlanc's skin? The answer is unknown. The next items I'd like to share come from the American Wild West, and their tale seems straight out of a Western film. In 1878, a cattle rustler and highwayman named George Parrott, who went by Big Nose George, killed 2 officers of the law when he and his gang attempted to rob a train in Wyoming near the Medicine Bow River. Deputy Sheriff Robert Widowfield and Union Pacific Detective Tip Vincent tracked the gang to their camp in Rattlesnake Canyon near Elk Mountain. Unfortunately for the lawmen, the gang had seen them coming. As the 2 men approached the camp, Parrott's gang ambushed them. Widowfield was shot in the face, and Vincent was shot as he tried to flee. The gang took the lawmen's weapons and horses, covered up their bodies, and fled the camp. The bodies were soon discovered, and a $10,000 reward was put up for anyone who apprehended the gang. In February 1879, Parrott and some of his gang were in Milestown, in what is now Miles City, in Montana. They attempted to rob a military convoy that was guiding a rich merchant. Near present-day Terry, Montana, the gang surrounded the convoy, soldiers and all, and made off with between $3,600 and $14,000. Reports vary, as this story has been embellished over the years. The reward for catching Parrott went up to $20,000 after this. In 1880, Parrott was finally found and arrested in a saloon in Miles City after he had drunkenly bragged about killing the 2 lawmen in Wyoming. He was returned to Wyoming to face charges and was sentenced to hang on April 2, 1881. While he was held at a jail in Rawlins, he attempted to escape by filing off the heavy shackles that bound his hands with a pocket knife and a piece of sandstone. When the jailer passed him, Parrott hit him over the head with the shackles. The jailer fought back and called to his wife Rosa, who persuaded Parrott back into his cell at the end of a pistol. Having heard of the attempted escape, a mob showed up at the jail, broke Parrott out of his cell, and hung him from a telegraph pole. His body was then swiftly delivered to Dr. Thomas McGee and Dr. Eugene Osborne, who had requested the corpse so they could examine Parrott's brain for clues about his criminality. After examining Parrott's brain, Dr. McGee gave the top of Parrott's skull to his assistant, Lillian Heath, who was 15 at the time and would later become the first female doctor in Wyoming. She used the skull cap as an ashtray for years afterwards. The skin from Parrott's thighs and chest was removed and sent to a tannery in Denver, where it was made into a pair of shoes and a medical bag. Dr. Osborne kept both items and wore the human leather shoes on the night he was inaugurated as the first Democratic governor of Wyoming. The rest of Parrott's body was dismembered and placed in a salt solution inside a whiskey barrel. Further experiments were done for about a year. Then the barrel was buried in the yard outside Dr. McGee's office. This story sounds like a tall tale, and it was mostly forgotten until 1950, when construction workers unearthed a whiskey barrel while building the Rawlins National Bank. Inside, the rest of the skull, the skin boots, and most of Parrott's bones were discovered. Dr. Lillian Heath, who was now in her 80s, was called to identify the remains. She sent her skullcap ashtray to the scene, and it was found to fit perfectly in place. DNA testing further revealed that these were indeed the remains of Big Nose George. The shoes made from his skin are now on permanent display at the Carbon County Museum in Rawlins, Wyoming, along with the skullcap ashtray. Early physicians were not only interested in human skin, they were also intrigued by what was on it. Tattoos have been inked into human skin since before written history. Some of the oldest examples include the tattoos of Otzi the Iceman, which are thought to have been medicinal in nature and dated to around 3250 BCE. Tattoos have also been found on Egyptian mummies from between 3351 and 3017 BCE. Tattoos have historically been regarded as uncivilized by the colonial West, thanks to their presence on the skin of the people they conquered. During the 1900s, tattoos were mostly associated with sailors, working men, and criminals. However, by the end of the 20th century, most of the stigma faded, and tattoos have now become generally accepted for all types of people. The physicians of the 19th century were quite interested in the tattoos of their patients, and some of them even started collecting, studying, and preserving the tattooed skin of their deceased patients. There were 2 ways they prepared and preserved this skin: wet and dry preparations. Wet preparations were more rare. First, the skin around the tattoo was flayed very carefully as not to damage the image. Then, the reverse side was scraped to remove any connective tissues still adhering to it. This skin was then kept either lying flat or pinned up in a glycerin or formalin alcohol solution. Dry preparations were started the same way, but after scraping the reverse side of the skin, it was stretched and pinned down to dry. It was also treated with various chemicals, either before or after it was pinned down, much like leather. The skin shrunk as it dried, leaving a sort of frill around the edges of the image. The reason these physicians collected tattoos was to decipher their meaning, create a taxonomy of the symbols that were used, and use this data to interpret a person's psychology, which they assumed was criminal. The largest collection of tattooed human skins is part of the Wellcome Collection at the Science Museum of London. Over 300 individual tattooed skin fragments were purchased from a mysterious Dr. Lavalette in the 1800s. The name Dr. Lavalette is likely a false name, and this person was probably trying to rid himself of ill-gotten human skins, as no one by this name could be found after the sale. Several other institutions have small collections of tattooed human skin. These include Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in France, which has 56, the Department of Forensic Medicine at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, which has 60, and the Medical Pathology Museum at Tokyo University, which has not only tattooed skin fragments, but also whole, full-body traditional Japanese tattoos. Dr. Masaichi Fukushi began the collection at Tokyo University, which includes 3,000 images of tattoos and over 100 skins and skin fragments. He acquired them while working in a charity hospital. He offered money to people to finish their full-body tattoos on the condition that he could harvest their skin after they died. Many people took him up on his offer. Dr. Fukushi's son, Dr. Katsunari Fukushi, is now responsible for this collection. The reason behind this collection was not to study criminality, but to preserve the art of tattooing. There is a similar movement today, led by the National Association for Preservation of Skin Art, or NAPSA, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving tattoos after death. The chairman of NAPSA, Charles Ham, states that no one would ever throw away a Picasso or any other piece of art that was created with passion, time, and energy. A tattoo is art with a unique story. It's just on a different canvas. Most of these collections of tattooed skin, as well as the objects made of human skin, are not on public display. Most museums and institutions are required to have a specific license in order to display human remains. This is to ensure that the remains are treated with the appropriate respect. The skin was part of a living person after all, and all people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Another reason these items are not displayed is that most of the skin used to make these objects was unethically sourced or taken without the consent of the individuals of whom it was once a part. There have been several extreme cases of this, such as a book being bound in the skin of an unknown female mental patient that died in France by Dr. Ludovic Bolland. The book was about female virginity and reproductive organs, written by men about women, and then bound in a woman's skin. It was coveted by the man it was made for, making it more of a fetish item. Knowing that the treatment of the mentally ill, and mentally ill women especially, was extremely poor at this time, makes the book and its binding even more ethically questionable. Items made from the skin of executed criminals and prisoners were also taken without their consent. Why did these physicians go to the trouble of taking human skin and having it made into wallets, shoes, bags, and book covers? What possessed them to do such a thing? One reason, which I mentioned before, was likely because they could, and wanted to prove it. Because of their profession, they had access, albeit unethical access, and thanks to their elevated position in society, they now had the money to have it done. Some of them probably sold these items as macabre collector's pieces, as antiquarians, the rich, and most people today like to own and display interesting and exotic items. Dr. Lindsay Fitzharris, a postdoctoral research fellow at Queen Mary University of London and a hero of mine, stated that there were three main reasons these physicians made items of human skin. One was the reason I already mentioned, in order to create strange and morbid collector's items that could be sold or displayed. The second reason was punishment. Dissection was seen as a final insult and ultimate punishment for the criminals who were executed. Using parts of their bodies to create objects was an even further insult. This meant their crimes would be remembered and spoken of long after their death. The last reason mentioned by Dr. Fitzharris was memorialization. This mostly applies to the more recent preservation of tattoos, but also to some of the book covers, like James Allen, who wanted to memorialize himself in this way. Keeping a piece of a person after they're gone has a bit of a macabre romance to it, and is therefore appealing to some. The removal and preservation of a loved one's tattoo can be provided by NAPSA, which will work with you to preserve your tattooed skin for your loved ones as a memorial. Whether taken with consent or otherwise, these items are quite macabre in that they dehumanize the people they were taken from. The person has become a material, a tool. This is why most people find objects made of human skin to be quite gruesome. The person is no longer present. However, these objects also draw out one of our most human emotions, and that is curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and give us a rating on iTunes. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, and liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. People like Tiffany, Rachel, Sarah, Knox Artemis, Diana, and McKinley from the Pretty Good Enough podcast. Thank you. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking on the donate button. On our website, you'll also find links to all our social media, links to our sponsors, and other ways to contact us. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.